Look, Bill Clinton's name has been attached to Jeffrey Epstein. Donald Trump's name's been attached to, I mean, it is a who's who of people have been, and it just smells as if some large hand said, we don't want this. Well, keep this rock.
It's a who's who of defense lawyers on the other side.
They had a 53-count indictment against him. All of a sudden, it disappears? Why? Why would that happen? How could that happen?
The first time I heard about the surveillance videos and tapes was from an extremely close friend of Ghislaine.
I saw where the cameras were at the 71st Street house because he showed me the room. And so I looked on those cameras and I saw that they were all very private scenes. And they were taping like the bathroom and the beds.
According to Ghislaine, there were secret surveillance tapes. The powerful people he had captured having sex in his bedrooms, presumably with underage girls, and that was his weapon.
Jeffrey and Ghislaine may have been sitting on videotapes. This was incriminating evidence against some of the rich and powerful individuals that they did business with.
I believe Jeffrey and Ghislaine were working together. Ghislaine was getting children, and then they were being put into horrible situations with these dignitaries and these men. Just in my opinion, from observing, there was a definite blackmail operation going on.
When we walked into the New York mansion, to Palm Beach, everything was being filmed. Government officials, the politicians, the royalty, they were taping everybody.
Do you think people knew they were being taped?
No.
No.
I do not. Not at all.
Maybe Ghislaine Maxwell knows where all those photographs and tapes and videos are.
So the $64,000 question here is, where are the tapes?
If they contain what we think they do, to say that they would be explosive would be the understatement of the day.
I've known Ghislaine since the 90s.
Oh, well, they were taking down the royal family, weren't they?
Well, who were?
Maybe Israel. Who knows?
Israel? Goodness me, come on. What do you mean, who knows?
Why would Israel be taking down the British royal family?
Tell me that.
Why would Israel be trying to concoct a
to
picture to shame the royal family?
I don't know, because
you just said it.
I'm not talking about those agencies right now. I made that clear. What I have...
You just said it was Israel.
Without talking about that, this is hard facts.
We want to talk about that. What is the genesis of your conspiracy
Tom,
theory?
just stop. This isn't a conspiracy.
Who had the motivation to do this?
Who is behind Jeffrey Epstein? Like, who is that? It's the intelligence three-letter word agencies that are wrapped up in this that I'm not going to go into right now because I would rather stay alive.
So let me take you to Robert Steele, who's a former CIA and military intelligence officer.
Okay.
This is his statement. He says, "I remain of the view that Jeffrey Epstein is a Mossad clandestine operations officer, assisted by Mossad clandestine operations officer Ghislaine Maxwell, and that their mission is to do precisely what they have been doing: entrap U.S. politicians, judges, celebrities, prosecutors, and corporate leaders."
And most governments will do this if they could. It just so happens the Israelis are really good at it.
Right. I mean, what could be a better asset than someone who has all this dirt, right? This quote-unquote blackmail on a lot of powerful players. And even Philip Giraldi, who's also a former CIA and military intelligence officer, said this. He said, "Here is how it would have gone if it were true. Mossad would have exploited Epstein's contacts, arranging their cooperation by having Epstein wining and dining them while flying them off to exotic locations, providing them with women and entertainment. If they refused to cooperate, it'd be time for blackmail, photos and videos of sex with underage women."
The dominant Epstein conspiracy theory is that he was videotaping all these high-profile people as blackmail. And the other side of that theory is maybe he was doing this on behalf of the CIA or intelligence agencies. He got recruited to spy for them. That's sort of the theory that ties it all together in terms of the videotaping and mysterious sort of high-profile connections, in terms of his ridiculous treatment by law enforcement in Palm Beach. And it does a pretty neat and tidy job.
Those videos could be used as blackmail, as compromising material on foreign dignitaries, on people in power. I have no doubt someone would have been interested in that kind of information.
I obviously have no idea what transpired with Epstein's video surveillance cameras. But on Maxwell's side, there's their father, Robert Maxwell. He was for sure involved with intelligence, probably both KGB and Mossad.
The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency.
Will he ask the Prime Minister to order an immediate inquiry into the alleged relationship between the Israeli intelligence service and Robert Maxwell?
The allegations about Maxwell's close connections with Israel were first made in a book by Seymour Hersh.
The man had an awful lot of information about an awful lot of things and did an awful lot that we don't know very much about.
One of the main sources of that book, Ari Ben-Menashe, a former Israeli intelligence officer, claimed that Maxwell had played a major role in smuggling arms for Israel.
Robert Maxwell was working for Israeli intelligence. He was an operative for quite a long time. He was a senior operative, as a matter of fact. I was working with him. I was sort of supervising what he was doing for us.
One of the things that I learned early on at the CIA, and this is certainly consistent in other intelligence organizations, is that they're often multi-generational. You want people in the same family because they know that you're loyal. Let's just say for the sake of argument that this was the Israelis that were involved. And Ghislaine Maxwell's father already had a relationship with the Israeli services. Ghislaine was important and well-connected and working at a higher level of society than most anybody else. So I don't think it's at all a leap in logic to think she's continuing to do daddy's work.
Epstein started working with Israeli intelligence as well. Selling or giving or collecting secrets, however you want to put it, yes, that's right. They were collecting secrets for the Israelis.
If he has all these secrets on people, you could see, okay, there's a motivation for some wealthy person to hire a hitman to go in and somehow murder him in prison.
I do believe he was killed by people that didn't want to be exposed.
I think there's a huge amount of conspiracy about how Epstein died and whether it was suicide or whether it was foul play, just as there has been about Robert Maxwell for many, many years.
In the Atlantic Ocean, a death and a mystery. Robert Maxwell disappeared from his yacht.
There are many parallels between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Did Maxwell jump off the back of the boat in the Canary Islands, or was he murdered? Did Epstein hang himself in a New York prison, or was he murdered? It's actually quite creepy, the similarities between them both. There's something very sinister about both stories.
It may be the most bizarre spy story ever. A story of corruption and betrayal at the highest levels of the American government. A story of hostages used as pawns, of the CIA spying on its friends, of murders made to look like suicides.
I think it's about time to get the whole story out.
His name is Ari Ben-Menashe. He's a former Israeli intelligence agent.
Once it's out, there's no reason to hurt me physically anymore.
And today, he is hiding in Australia, in fear, he says, of his life.
So many people in the last 10 years who were working for the various governments on these issues, due to cover-ups, died mysteriously.
He claims the United States tried to spy on ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, by selling it a computer program that contained a hidden keyhole, a lock for which the CIA had a master key. The computer software is called PROMIS. It's designed to track millions of pieces of information on tens of thousands of people. And it's alleged to have been installed in dozens of government departments and security agencies around the world. It's also alleged that American intelligence made some small modifications to the program, modifications that enabled it to key in a special access code and gain entry to all the information on the computer.
It would be equivalent to going into ASIO and reading the handwritten files of all the agents, except the computer has them neatly organized and typed and instantly indexed, so it's much more convenient.
Bill Hamilton owns Inslaw, the company that developed PROMIS and offered it to the American government.
They would not have bothered to sell it to all these countries without first preparing it in such a way that it would be an easier avenue of penetration into the files of these foreign governments.
The whole story might never have emerged but for the fact that the American government didn't own PROMIS. It pirated the software from Bill Hamilton's company.
We were dumbfounded, couldn't conceive of it.
Hamilton's contract with the US Department of Justice to supply the PROMIS software was cancelled in 1982 without any real explanation. Only some time later did Hamilton hear that his software was turning up all over the world.
I don't know how much Australia paid. I've been told that Israel paid $5.5 million.
Ari Ben-Menashe confirms that PROMIS was sold to Israel, but claims the Israelis, unlike the Australians, were in on the secret.
The whole idea was that we would study it, the Americans then would sell it to our neighbors, and then we could, by using telephone lines, get into our neighbors' computers. But then our American friends just took it a step further. They sold it to their allies as well, including Australia.
The list of countries which allegedly bought the PROMIS software reads like a who's who of America's friends, as well as its most bitter enemies.
Is spying on your friends considered a fair thing to do in the intelligence world?
Oh, it is. It's always done. Using a Trojan horse to go inside the agency, that gets a little aggressive, you know.
Ben-Menashe was an officer in the Israeli military intelligence service for 12 years. And he was involved at the highest level in some very, very interesting things. But Ben-Menashe, it's a very long story who he is and the controversy surrounding him for the last 2 or 3 years. But one of the things we owe to him is gratitude for having outlined how the PROMIS software developed by the Inslaw company was marketed around the world to intelligence and security services. The Israelis also marketed it around the world through another so-called private individual, i.e. Robert Maxwell, the tycoon who owned the mirror interests in Britain and who later was killed. Ben-Menashe is certain that he was killed, that he didn't commit suicide when he fell off his yacht. But in any case, the Israelis and the CIA created trapdoors into this program. Trapdoors meaning a way through modems in which they could have access to the computers of the host intelligence or security service. They tried it first with the Jordanians, and as soon as it was installed through the trapdoor program, the Israelis were reading all the files of the Jordanian military intelligence service. And of course, the principal target of the Jordanians were the Palestinians, which were the Israelis' principal targets. And so they were able to collect an enormous amount of information by monitoring what the Jordanians were doing through this PROMIS software. The same thing happened in Guatemala. The Israelis were able, with the CIA, to monitor the way the Guatemalan security services were using PROMIS in the political repression. And this PROMIS system has been sold around the world by the CIA through Earl Bryan and by the Israelis through Robert Maxwell before he died, because those two had companies in which they could make it appear to be a commercial transaction, and the buying companies would never know that that trapdoor existed. Well, it was sold to the British, the Canadians, the South Koreans, the Australians, Iraq also. That's by Earl Bryan on the side of the CIA, and by Maxwell for the Israelis to Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Nicaragua, Soviet Union, where they got into the files of Soviet military intelligence in the 1980s, the GRU. Other countries as well. So that it is the ultimate, really the ultimate big brother system that anyone could imagine.
Both Ari Ben-Menashe and Rafi Eitan came to the same conclusion very quickly. And they said one word. Robert said Ben-Menashe, and Rafi completely said, yep, Maxwell. He's the man. So Maxwell was hauled in, and he immediately saw for himself this was a wonderful chance to make money. And he didn't understand software at that stage, but my goodness me, he was on a fast learning curve. And he set off to sell PROMIS, which was the name of the software. He went off around the world. Maxwell then became not just super spy, but ultra super salesman. He went off round the world, and he pulled it off brilliantly.
Gordon, briefly explain to our listeners why Mossad wanted Maxwell to sell this PROMIS software to other government agencies around the world. He sold it, I guess, to Canada and European nations. What was Mossad's hidden motive in getting this PROMIS software into the government computers of other nations?
Well, very simply, it gave Mossad an inside track view of what was happening when everybody was using PROMIS. Sitting in Tel Aviv, Rafi Eitan and his technicians would know exactly what was going on in those departments, in those people using it. For instance, with a single piece of paper, you can pretty well track anybody, that person's life, where he's done, his phone calls and so on. It's like a never-widening ripple that goes on, and the information is just priceless when it comes back, because it's all sorted and coded for you and decoded and so on. Well, what he was able to do, for instance, he would go to the Russians and say, you need this to keep track of what your little friends in the Soviet satellites are doing, and Khrushchev said, you're absolutely right. And Maxwell would demonstrate it, and the Russians, KGB, would have it. But what they didn't realize, sitting in Tel Aviv, there were people listening to what the KGB were doing. It became extraordinary because Maxwell enabled the Israelis. They were able to listen into the Syrians. Maxwell sold it at cut-price lots to the Egyptians. He sold it everywhere.
Gordon, was the CIA aware of the trapdoor?
Not initially, because they were building their own version of PROMIS, which they'd also got from Justice.
So this went for years with only the Israeli Mossad knowing about the trapdoor.
Yeah.
The PROMIS software that was something that Robert Maxwell had been involved in. I think he owned it or he bought it.
He was given a license to sell it by the Israelis. It's an American software, but this was a software that was helping prosecutors at the Department of Justice follow cases through the prosecution of criminals, but it was also a brilliant first time ever thing that allowed them to cross-reference different databases with each other. So that's why it was such an important thing. And the Israelis had an agreement with the Americans to sort of take it or steal it or whatever version of the story you want, and that's how Robert Maxwell got his hands on it.
You talk about the fact that in the 1980s you had the Iran-Iraq war, you had Iran Contra.
What began as a secret weapons for hostage exchange burgeoned into a multi-billion-dollar business for American and Israeli intelligence organizations with the knowledge of Reagan and Vice President Bush.
We want the truth.
When Iran went to war with Iraq, the potential profits became irresistible.
Fundamental right.
Despite a congressional ban on weapons to Iran, American agencies saw an opportunity to raise black money to fund their favorite right-wing rebel group in Nicaragua, the Contras, which the American Congress had also banned them from assisting. Ayatollah Khomeini was the bin Laden of his day, the sworn enemy of the great state in America. The notion that Israeli and American intelligence agencies were selling him weapons was so bizarre that initially it begged belief. A disbelief that allowed the operation to run for 7 years before it was exposed. Originally, the plan to disguise the US operation was a simple one. Sell massive amounts of weapons to ally Israel, who would then simply on-sell them secretly to the Iranians. A profitable plan for both nations that nearly came unstuck when the Russians shot down one of the Israeli cargo planes.
Ari Ben-Menashe was an Israeli intelligence officer attached to the Israeli Defense Forces.
We start seeing hard intelligence that the Iraqis were preparing for war. And the Israelis were extremely worried about that. They did not want, in no way, the Iraqis to be an overwhelming power in the Middle East.
By early 1980, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin was hearing Iranian appeals for military equipment.
Their biggest worry was the Air Force. They had no tires. Their F-4s had flat tires. They were not in good condition. They were looking for spare parts and tires and wheelbases. These were their first inquiries. And we sold them the tires.
The tire sale did not please President Carter.
There had been a rather tense discussion between President Carter and Prime Minister Begin in the spring of 1980, in which the president made clear that the Israelis had to stop that, and that we knew that they were doing it, and that we would not allow it to continue, at least not to allow it to continue privately and without the knowledge of the American people.
Although Begin agreed to Carter's demand, the confrontation revealed the divergent interests of the two nations regarding Iran. An officer on the State Department's Israeli desk, David Satterfield, said that Secretary Haig did not flatly forbid Israeli transshipment of U.S. weapons to Iran. Satterfield was interviewed years later by Iran Contra investigators, and Frontline has obtained a copy of his still classified statement. Satterfield said that Haig told Israel that in principle this was okay, but only for F-4 spare parts. Haig also insisted that the United States had to approve in advance specific lists of parts to be sold by Israel to Iran. By spring 1982, American officials were to object that the Israelis had gone too far, but by then, Satterfield said, approximately $53 million in weapons and parts had been sent to Iran, most of which were not within the agreed-upon guidelines. A senior Israeli intelligence official told Frontline that in 1981 and 82, a wide range of American equipment flowed covertly through Israel to Iran. The equipment included spare parts for F-4 fighter planes, for M-48 tanks, and for M-113 armored personnel carriers. This source put the value of the material at $246 million. Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe says he was one of half a dozen Israelis sent to Paris at Casey's request to help coordinate arms deliveries.
A Mr. Ari Ben-Menashe, former Israeli military intelligence officer.
That's how I got to know Maxwell. I was part of the team that was exporting arms to the Iranians during their war against Iraq.
So the way it supposedly worked was this. The Iranians would send funds to Bahrain, who in turn paid Maxwell, who then paid Israel. All of this has subsequently been reported in news outlets, except for the intimate role that Robert Maxwell allegedly played. Now, this alleged role, according to Ben-Menashe, was that Maxwell was the middleman, moving payments for arms around in the Iran-Iraq war and also involving the Eastern Bloc.
A lot of it was bought from the Soviet Union at the time. And we were sending it to the Iranians.
and the Iranians would pay through Maxwell, pay the Israelis through Robert Maxwell.
It was within this context that Jeffrey was allegedly brought under Israel's influence. Ben Menashe says that he knows about Maxwell's dealings in the 1980s because Ben Menashe was also involved in arms dealing for the Israelis in this period. Ben Menashe's name captured headlines in 1989 when he was caught in the US, trying to broker a sale of US military aircraft to Iran on behalf of Israel. He was charged with violating the US Arms Control Export Act, and he spent a year in a US jail before the case went to trial. His defense argued that he was working for the Israeli government, and the US jury believed that. He was acquitted.
One of the key witnesses in the Iran Contra scandal was an Israeli intelligence officer imprisoned in America on arms dealing charges. Abandoned by Israel, he began to talk about the work he'd done for Israeli and American intelligence in trading weapons to Iran, and he was acquitted. Few would now doubt that he did work for Israeli intelligence and that he was extensively involved in the shipment of weapons to Iran.
And it leapt out at me that somebody I know very well, Christopher Mason, goes to meet Ghislaine Maxwell in 1991 in New York, and one of her dinner guests is Oliver North.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. That's a good connection. That's amazing.
Selese's son or someone. I mean,
Right.
and as we talked about last time, Jeffrey Epstein at that period of his life is renting
The Iranian.
an Iranian government building
Yeah.
in New York. And, and so it goes. And what the heck is he doing? The association with Douglas Lease, of all people, who was tied, his son Julian told me his father was not tied to the El Yamama arms deal. And yet it's in the parliamentary record that he was. And again, Douglas Lease, in all likelihood, I mean, Julian Lease, I know, will tell me I'm wrong, but many, many people I know think Douglas Lease was involved in British intelligence.
Jeffrey then dashed over to London, where he met Douglas Lease. Douglas Lease was an international arms merchant, and he was able to mold Jeffrey into this world of arms dealing. This was an area of the financial world that was very shady, and the money at this point was pouring in.
I will say one thing, Lawrence, about that passport. Jeffrey Epstein has testified in the late 1980s that he was finding money for people. I can tell you that, according to one of my sources, one of those people was Adnan Khashoggi. He's now dead. Big Saudi, yes. So that might explain.
He's a big Saudi businessman. At the time, we thought the
Yes.
richest of the Saudi businessmen.
Yes.
Yeah. So Khashoggi would have been in a position to help him get a Saudi.
No, he would have been. And if Jeffrey Epstein was finding money that was stolen from him, that would explain it.
We're going to have to leave it there for tonight.
So Adnan Khashoggi is famous for being an arms trafficker, one of the biggest names in arms trafficking through that 70s and 80s period.
Saudi,
and
like
he's
royal
Saudi by
connections.
birth, right?
Yeah.
But my understanding is it is quite well known at this point that he was arms trafficking on behalf of probably many nations, but he certainly did a lot of work with Mossad and Israel in that time frame. He often I think different people sort of portray him some people portray him as being sort of like an Israeli arms trafficking asset, and other people portray him as more of like a freeloader trafficking asset, and I don't have a perspective one way or the other on that. But he was well known for having this fucking giant yacht that was cameraed up to the nines, and he would bring his arms deals onto that yacht and ply them with girls and money and drugs and food and anything they wanted while filming everything secretly, and running his own little blackmail show around his arms deals as he went. I'm not sure where he learned that, but that's that boat that Trump later bought and renamed.
Publicity about your acquisition of the boat this summer. The Princess, is that what
I
we call
bought a
it?
boat from Adnan Khashoggi, which was formerly called the Nabila
Nabila.
It's a yacht. And
Adnan Khashoggi, excuse me for a second, is the world's largest arms trader?
I hate to admit it.
So back to Robert Maxwell's dealings with the Soviets, the Iranians, and the Israelis in the 1980s. It's into this world that Jeffrey Epstein allegedly steps. Jeffrey would be brought in to help Israel's national security efforts. The help went far beyond the kind of back-channel diplomacy and money moving that Maxwell had done for the Israelis. Several of my sources say that Jeffrey used blackmail to promote Israel's interests as part of a massive influence campaign on the United States. Why? Because Jeffrey had become an arms dealer and a money launderer in the Middle East and elsewhere, according to sources. So here's another little piece of history that you need to know in order to understand how Jeffrey got here. While the Iran-Iraq war raged in the early 1980s, the biggest arms deal ever was going down between the British and the Saudis. El Yamama. It's now infamous for how corrupt it was. Jeffrey was working with two men reported to be critically involved with the behind-the-scenes deal-makers of El Yamama. One, allegedly, was a British defense contractor, Douglas Lease. The other was the Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi. Khashoggi was Saudi Arabia's lead arms dealer in the 1970s and 80s, and that helped him build staggering wealth, which in turn funded a headline-grabbing and wildly ostentatious lifestyle. But also investigations into his shady business deals, like being Oliver North's arms broker in the Iran Contra scandal. Now, both Lease and Khashoggi knew Robert Maxwell, as did Jeffrey, according to several sources. They all three met in the early 1980s. According to a very close friend of Khashoggi's and of Jeffrey's, the Syrian banker Amer Pasha, Maxwell had met Khashoggi through Jeffrey, and they'd become close.
I mean, I don't know how it came about, but it happened on the occasion where he mentioned that it was Maxwell that introduced him to Jeffrey. Sometimes even it happened with other people around, but I can't remember who.
Separately, Jeffrey told a business colleague in the 1980s, Stephen Hoffenberg, that Jeffrey was advising Maxwell on his businesses, specifically restructuring debt.
You know, the thing is about the money that I keep coming back to, because this is really the question I was trying to answer for you, was how did Epstein get so rich? Because, you know, he died, has $600 million value. That was sort of the entire estate. It's not...
That we know of.
Yeah, that we know of. But the amount of money that went in seems about $3 billion when you look at what Maxwell had off the books. You know, Maxwell had the on-the-books kind of media empire, and then he had all these other operations, PROMIS, making him $100 million a year. He had this Iran Contra money that he was partly a slush fund from the Israelis and the CIA. Then he took even more money from all those endeavors of selling all these arms to different countries. And then he had this commission, this 20% commission on all the money he was transferring out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union, into the West. You know, it's a lot of money that he was amassing. And where did it go? You know, it's not
well,
stuff
he's
that...
very good. I mean, this was the other thing as I was re-listening. Tom Bauer, who's a very fantastic British journalist and an old friend of mine who wrote a biography of Maxwell, says in the podcast that that Maxwell was incredibly talented at hiding money. He'd done it all his life. So the idea that he hadn't got it stashed away in Switzerland and Liechtenstein and all over the place, of course he did. And
just like Maxwell.
Yeah, and I'm listening to my own, and I'm listening to me telling you, you know, we've just heard how Jeffrey Epstein knows how to, knows all about Swiss bank accounts.
The mystery of Robert Maxwell multiplied today with the collapse of his publishing empire.
His crumbling empire is missing $1.2 billion. That's billion.
Employees of the Mirror newspapers learned that more than $1 billion had been siphoned off from their pension fund.
When Robert Maxwell died and the financial mismanagement of the Mirror Group became apparent, it became one of the biggest stories in British modern history.
British newspapers are now having a field day reporting the scandal. In the lead, Maxwell's own Daily Mirror, desperately trying to solve the mystery of what its publisher did with the money.
He had taken £400 million from the pensioners at the Mirror Group.
Maxwell stole not just the pension funds, but he stole lots of other companies. His total takings were at least £2 billion in 1991. So in current terms, you're talking of a fraud of at least 5 to 10 billion pounds sterling. And the Maxwell name was dirt and synonymous with fraud.
I got the impression at the time that the consequences of her father's death was that she had no money and that her mother was dealing with financial terrible reversals.
The shares, which were really the value of my husband's fortune, have collapsed, and from whatever was there, is now at zero. I have myself no money at all.
I subsequently learned that Ghislaine had a trust fund.
I met Jeffrey Epstein. He was a young, rather good-looking Jewish boy from New York that somehow appeared in Robert Maxwell's office. And I used to see him quite often in the office.
Jeffrey Epstein presented himself to Robert Maxwell as a financial expert. Jeffrey Epstein was charming. He was charismatic and could read the person he's dealing with and understand what that person wants to hear. He was a mastermind of how to manipulate and seduce people. So Robert Maxwell entered into a deep relationship in business with Jeffrey Epstein. At that particular time, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein met in London at the introduction by Robert Maxwell.
Take me back to the 1980s, because Ari Ben-Menashe says that's when Ghislaine was smitten by Jeffrey Epstein, and Robert Maxwell brings her in, and then him in, Jeffrey Epstein in, to introduce him to Ari Ben-Menashe and says, we want this guy to work for us doing Iran Contra. Can you confirm any of those details?
I can help you understand the timeline and who participated with Jeffrey Epstein and how he became a spy and what he did when he became a spy. I can help you in all those areas because I was there.
You were there? Did he tell you I'm a spy? Did he go and say I'm working for the Israelis?
Yes. He told me that he was a spy. He was fully aware that I was asked to join to be a spy and that I rejected the request.
So Douglas Lease asked you to join them and be a spy, and you said, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that.
I rejected the request of the spying.
Okay.
Jeffrey Epstein accepted the request of the spying, and he further cemented his opportunity in espionage when he met Ghislaine Maxwell and entered into a serious relationship with her as a lady-man relationship that was a very strong bond between them, a very powerful and dynamic work relationship between the two of them, and they've admitted to the public that they took over Robert Maxwell's spying records, operations, and moved that to Florida, to Jeffrey Epstein's house. That's been admitted. That's a fact.
Hoffenberg told me almost off the cuff one day, as I was talking to him about a whole bunch of other things. He said, I said, well, why wouldn't you tell me who he spied for? He said, you really want to know? And I said, yeah, just tell me. And he said, Israel. And I was blown away when he said the word Israel, because I'm Israeli. I was born in Israel, and I never think of Israel as conducting spy or espionage activities against America. I'd never think of that as other than there's one example of Pollard, but I never thought, there'd be the sophisticated espionage campaign going on. But I was like, okay, I'll put that in my back pocket. I can't go with one source on that. I'll just think about that. And, I was building information to try and figure out how to prove that. And then a few weeks later, I was able to get an interview with Ari Ben-Menashe, who was the handler of Robert Maxwell back in the Iran Contra days. He's kind of a famous spy figure in the world. He invited me to Montreal, where he told me on the record that Epstein was a spy for the Israelis. He worked for Israeli military intelligence, the same arm that he was a commander in years earlier when he was working with Maxwell.
The allegations about Maxwell's close connections with Israel were first made in a book by Seymour Hersh.
The man had an awful lot of information about an awful lot of things and did an awful lot that we don't know very much about.
One of the main sources of that book, Ari Ben-Menashe, a former Israeli intelligence officer, claimed that Maxwell had played a major role in smuggling arms for Israel.
Robert Maxwell was working for Israeli intelligence. He was an operative for quite a long time. He was a senior operative, as a matter of fact. I was working with him. I was sort of supervising what he was doing for us.
There was another former CIA agent called Victor Ostrowski who I talked to.
But former Mossad agent Victor Ostrowski likens Maxwell's role for the Israelis as the equivalent of being a Russian sleeper. Somebody whose business and political contacts were a very useful way to pass on information and money.
Looking for influence with the American president? Who isn't? There's a name for that today, which is called perception makers.
Perception makers.
Yeah, it's like you have a PR firm. Mm-hmm. It's like a PM firm. It's a perception maker, because what you say is, okay, if I tell you the Russians are bad, and I can bring things that made it happen, that that they're responsible for A, B, C, and D, I can create the perception, whether it's true or not, of something being real.
The achievement at the end of it is that I feel that my life, which I'm continuing to live to the full, and will do so until the day I die, I will have left the world a slightly better place by having lived in it and have influenced a few things and people in the right direction, rather as if it hadn't mattered whether I was born, lived, or died.
Then when Daddy died, she was left with no choice. So she moved on and teamed up with him.
The Board of Mirror Group newspapers announces with deep regret that Robert Maxwell is missing at sea, feared lost overboard from his motor yacht, the Lady Ghislaine.
The gathering of Robert Maxwell's family was completed, with the arrival of the daughter after whom he had named his faithful yacht.
For Ghislaine, that was the most seismic event of her life.
His body was found floating in the water, and there were 3 post-mortems, and no one could agree on what the cause of death was. So there's a lot of conspiracy around the circumstance of his death.
He committed suicide. He was rubbed out by assassins from a 2-man submarine, poisoning, strangling, even overwork.
There were reports that she arrived on the boat and had personal documents and important documents shredded.
A very reliable Daily Mirror reporter said that he saw Ghislaine shredding documents.
That shows that she would have had quite an involvement with the business to have known what documents to shred.
I want also to thank the press.
So you have the public face, in which she's handling the press and inquiries very well, and then you have the private shredding of documents. This was a loyal daughter, ensuring that whatever fate her father had befallen, she wasn't willing to let light in on the darkness.
Undoubtedly, they didn't want other people to know what the papers revealed about Maxwell's business.
Miss Maxwell, may we ask you something on behalf of the family about what conclusions the family feel about
Well, all these things will be revealed. That was the statement. Just thank you very much. Thank you.
There was suspicion and rumours around Robert Maxwell's business dealings. A lot of people hated him. He would have picked up a lot of enemies along the way. You know, in the interview Ghislaine gave about 7 years after his death, she said she thought it was murder. But there's never been any evidence to back that up.
What do you feel? What happened to him?
You'll never know, so you'll never be 100% sure of exactly what took place. The only thing I'm sure of is that he did not commit suicide.
Would you agree with somebody that he might commit suicide? Because most of the people say he would
Never. Never. It's never entered my mind.
He wasn't suicidal at all?
No. This is not possible. He would never have done that.
Mm-hmm.
He's a fighter. He's a totally born fighter. No way.
Viktor Ostrovsky alleges that Maxwell had asked the Mossad for financial help. When they refused, things got ugly. Ostrovsky left the Mossad several years before this happened.
He didn't understand that you do not threaten the Mossad. I mean, you can do a lot of other things, but do not threaten them because they take that very seriously. So when a threat is made, it basically cuts all the history or good history that was there and valuable and whatever, and it's all gone through the window.
So do you think Robert Maxwell was killed by the Mossad?
I think so, yeah.
So that's one possible theory as to why Maxwell may have been murdered. Here's Ari Ben Menashe.
I believe that Robert Maxwell had to be gotten rid of because he was about to be arrested by the British police, and he would have had to go on trial and go through details that the Israelis and others did not want to be made public.
It wasn't just his narcissism any longer.
Martin Dillon, again.
He was becoming very, very uncontrollable. And I think that Mossad knew that the end had come. And it's not as if Israel hasn't, in the past decided that someone has to go.
He was then buried with full Israeli state honors on the Mount of Olives, buried by the President and the Prime Minister of Israel, and no less than 7 serving or former heads of the Mossad.
Robert Maxwell, who paid little attention to his Jewish origins until near the end of his life, asked to be buried in Jerusalem, and the entire Israeli establishment came to pay tribute. Prime Minister Shamir, Defense Minister Aarons, Housing Minister Sharon.
By 1991, Robert Maxwell was a major personality in Israel. He was very close to the Israeli government. He rediscovered his Jewish roots, and he felt very at home there. So it was natural for them to want to bury him in the most sacred place in Jerusalem.
So it's quite clear that Robert Maxwell did perform what the President of Israel called at the funeral extraordinary service for Israel.
It's been incorrectly reported that Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein first met when Ghislaine came to America, and that's been an error. They met in London way before she came to America.
So her father dies around November of 91, and then it's just a few weeks after he dies, she seems to be associating with Epstein publicly.
Ghislaine set her sights on Jeffrey Epstein, who could give her the lifestyle that she'd become accustomed to.
The men that she tended to be around, I mean, I don't know if they were all corrupt, but Epstein and her father, I mean, those would be two men that had that kind of terrible moral compass.
Jeffrey wanted to get in that world of financial fraud. He viewed it as a place where he could capitalize. And that's exactly what he did.
And so Epstein hooks up with a real bona fide Ponzi artist named Stephen Hoffenberg. I don't know if you've spoken to him, but he's an entertaining character.
I was charged with securities violations, obstruction of justice, tax violations, mail fraud, activities of misconduct that I pled guilty to.
Hoffenberg pled guilty to fraud, admitting that he cheated investors out of nearly $500 million. He'll now have to pay as much restitution as he can to those taken in his Ponzi scheme.
It was one of the biggest Ponzi schemes recorded at that time in the U.S. history, yes. I suffered 18 years in federal prison without exposing the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. And in my opinion, he stole over $100 million from Towers Financial.
As Jeffrey Epstein is wont to do, he avoided investigation. He avoided any sort of scrutiny for his behavior in that Ponzi scheme. But it is after that that he seems to have accumulated a substantial amount of wealth.
The Towers thing, so it had Adnan Khashoggi as a principal, or at least an investor. It had Douglas Lease as a principal. It had money coming in from the Philippines, the Marcoses, right? It was cleaning Marcos's money. It potentially had the Queen's money in there, or it potentially had who's the other world leader? I'm thinking Putin's money in there, or something like that. And so this is when you look at all, and it had a lot of GOP people in the advisory boards, and and he kept talking about how connected he was to Hoffenberg did about all these Republicans. So you've got all these power brokers that also happen to be involved in Iran Contra to some extent, and so and that's why I was like, well, this got to be a money washer for the Iran Contra money, and I did never ask this on the record with Hoffenberg because I just knew the answer was going to be too much for him to confirm. But I did when I met him in person at one time. I pulled him aside and I said, all of this just doesn't make sense unless it belongs to Iran Contra. And he confirmed that it was, but he didn't even realize it until much later that was what Iran Contra, that the money would have been washed through, not necessarily Iran Contra, but the proceeds of all these weapons deals that Douglas Lease was involved in.
Yeah. So I've always had the impression, and by the way, I asked Khashoggi's daughter about this as well, and I think, if memory serves, she remembered Douglas Lease, and I think Maxwell, yes. I don't know if she knew about the Epstein connection. But I will tell you, Zev, that based on my reporting, and obviously I never met Douglas Lease, but I know a lot of people who did know him. I have to believe that he would have been the mastermind. He and Khashoggi, who he was very close to, because everything that that I would have to believe that Hoffenberg would have been a more patsy figure
Mhm.
in that he would have been a useful, ambitious guy who was willing to cut corners. We know that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Hoffenberg told me that Lease was the guy who created the handover, who masterminded the handover between Maxwell and
Yeah.
and Epstein. That was his creation. He figured it out, and you know, this is what he did. I mean, Douglas Lease was involved in a few scandals involving weapons trading around the world. Julian Lease was involved in one of them too in the Far East. So, you know, that he was a sort of senior operator who's able to handle the Al Yamana deals. It was obviously putting very close to the British government and the
I'll
Queen.
just give you
Yeah.
two little anecdotes on this. So I do have a British friend who was sent round to Douglas Lease by his father to he needed a passport in a hurry and no questions asked, and Douglas Lease was able to do that. But when I have the transcripts of all my conversations with Jeffrey Epstein, so I asked him about Douglas Lease, and he got sudden amnesia. Douglas who?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, maybe, that was somebody possibly related to a Nick Ferranti. I mean, he got, that he did not want to pursue that line of conversation.
The same thing happened with Ari Ben Menashe when I asked him about Douglas Lease. He was like, no, I don't know who that person is. And I was like, how could you not know who that person is? So, but this was an era that they were trying to cover up. This whole period in the 80s, they were trying to keep that secret because that's the planning stage for this takeover, this handover from Maxwell to Epstein.
US retailing billionaire Leslie Wexner founded L Brands, the company behind Victoria's Secret.
Wexner hired him, and that's what made Jeffrey a rich man.
Epstein worked as Wexner's money manager, but they had a very strangely close relationship. And a lot of colleagues of Wexner's and former friends have gone on record to talk about how strange the whole thing was.
In 1991, Wexner gave Jeffrey power of attorney over everything except for the limited. It was an extraordinary thing to do. A source told me recently that even the lawyers who drafted the agreement could just not understand why Wexner was doing it, and they expressed their concern.
Well, Epstein's name really started coming out around 1991, the year he gets the durable power of attorney to move all of Wexner's billions. So at that point, it's at a certain level in the city, people are gossiping. And the question is, what's their relationship?
There is this suggestion that, the mark, if you like, was Leslie Wexner.
So, do you think Jeffrey targeted Les Wexner as part of this Israeli influence campaign?
Without a question, Jeffrey desperately wanted the relationship with Leslie Wexner. That was a critical turning point for Jeffrey. And Ghislaine was very helpful with that opportunity for Jeffrey because she was very popular, very, very popular. And she was a big asset to Jeffrey. So it all came together very well for Ghislaine and Jeffrey at that time frame. It was a tragedy of the death. It was a sad circumstance for the Maxwell family. But Jeffrey was entrenched in the family affairs and did an awful lot in support of the tragedy, the death of Robert Maxwell for the Maxwell family.
Ben Menashe also says, along with Hoffenberg, that the whole idea of befriending Wexner originated with Robert Maxwell. The idea was to gather information and pass it along.
Jeffrey Epstein was mentored substantially by Robert Maxwell on how to deal with national security. And what you're linking together is how Jeffrey Epstein applied his national security training to the three countries, to the UK, to Israel, to the United States, and how it benefited Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell substantially. That's the linkage, and that's the mystery.
When Hoffenberg is talking about, quote, national security, he's not talking about spying. Instead, he's talking about business and social relationships between high-powered international players that can sometimes become enmeshed in politics.
So Alan Dershowitz tells me at one point that for Leslie Wexner's birthday, Jeffrey Epstein flew John Glenn, the astronaut, and Alan to Wexner's home in Ohio, where Shimon Peres was the guest of honor, educating everyone about Israeli affairs.
And listen to this story about Leslie Wexner's 59th birthday party and how Jeffrey set it all up. But this time, Jeffrey is playing an almost eerily similar role to what Glenn played in Jeffrey's birthday party. Here's former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz.
Me and Senator John Glenn on his plane. I don't remember if he picked me up in Boston or I was in New York, but I do recall flying on his plane, the small plane, a small 10-seater, 8-seater, something like that, with Senator John Glenn, who was then a sitting senator and a former astronaut. And at the dinner was Shimon Peres, who talked a lot about Picasso, because Leslie Wexner owned a number of fantastic Picassos from the Blue Period and other periods, and Shimon Peres knew a lot about art.
Shimon Peres was an Israeli politician who later was elected president.
And maybe one other person. That's it, all men. I remember that because when I came back, I didn't stay over. I flew back that night to either New York or Boston and told my wife about it. And she said, why were there only men at this event? And I found out that both Epstein and Wexner liked to have men-only events, and that's the last time I ever went to an event at Leslie Wexner's.
Did you have any sense of what his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein was at that dinner?
Very close. It's clearly a very close relationship. At that time, Jeffrey Epstein owned a house on Leslie Wexner's premises. He showed me the house at a distance, or showed me where it was, but total, I probably met Leslie Wexner maybe 3 times or 4 times in my life, and I got the impression that there was a very close, long-standing, very trusting relationship between Epstein and Wexner. I didn't know its exact nature and still don't know its exact nature, and I just think that's something that's a very interesting connection that should be explored.
And here's yet another thing that Jeffrey reportedly did while spending time in central Ohio, Wexner's home base. Remember local journalist Bob Fitrakis? Well, Bob Fitrakis has a theory about all of this. We don't have the facts to prove it true or false. But back in 2002, Bob told me that Jeffrey even got a cargo airline called Southern Air Transport to move its headquarters to Columbus, Ohio, out of Miami. Now, this was helpful to Wexner because it would mean multiple direct flights each week between Ohio and Hong Kong to transport cargo for the limited. Seems simple enough. Except nothing is simple with Jeffrey.
Southern Air Transport, which was the most notorious gun-running airline in the world at a time when I was following that. Mr. Epstein was in charge of the logistics of helping to move it here for Mr. Wexner. I mean, this is the former Air America drug and gun-running airline covert operations. I mean, this was a CIA proprietary affront, and it ran guns and arms.
Alan Dershowitz says that Jeffrey could make problems go away, thus avoiding public litigation. Alan told me a story that Jeffrey had told him about Wexner's airplane. This was in the 1990s. Alan says that Jeffrey claimed to him that Wexner's plane was boarded when he landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, and that contraband was allegedly found. And according to Jeffrey, there was a big possibility that the plane could be confiscated.
And they found him with tens of thousands of dollars worth of Cuban cigars that he was trying to smuggle into the country. They also found, according to Epstein, $50,000 in cash, also illegally.
Jeffrey phoned Dershowitz to see if he could help. But Jeffrey told Dershowitz that he couldn't. He didn't have any connections to help with customs. And frankly, he didn't see any way round the problem. Yet somehow, miraculously apparently, Jeffrey told Dershowitz a few days later that he'd made the problem go away, quietly.
Jeffrey Epstein settled that case politically for him without involving lawyers, and other cases were settled as well.
So how did Jeffrey get this to just go away? Alan doesn't know. One source told me that Jeffrey was close with many US customs officials. It's a pretty significant question, because years later it emerged that Jeffrey had avoided very serious federal charges and instead got a cushy sentence on state charges around something called a non-prosecution agreement. Now this made everyone wonder, what exactly was his clout with the law in this country? In hindsight, it looks like he had quite a lot.
Hello? Detective Jerry Carey with Palm Beach Police.
Palm Beach Police, when they did the search warrant, found evidence that they had a serial pedophile on their hands. But the feds did nothing. They did nothing.
Could you please give us your name?
Jeffrey Epstein.
He's arrested, he's charged, but he gets this sweetheart deal.
The guilty plea and deal-ending process that could have sent Epstein to jail for 15 years.
And he got 18 months because they, pardon my French, didn't give a shit about the victims.
The deal they made was the dumbest deal in history.
He was able to have work release privileges and leave his jail cell.
He negotiated also essentially immunity for Ghislaine Maxwell.
Why? Why would that happen?
I believe it was a blackmail operation. I mean, what else would it be? These people get away with everything.
The FBI didn't want to know what Ghislaine Maxwell knew. This was a cover-up.
The state's happy they have a conviction. Epstein got this sweetheart deal. Everybody's happy. They believed this thing was going to go away. That's, I think, what Epstein and Maxwell were counting on.
In 2019, I reported for the Daily Beast that senior government officials were told that Jeffrey had, quote, belonged to intelligence, hence his cushy deal. Vanessa Neumann is a former national security and terrorist analyst for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And in your experience, does it happen in America? Can the American Department of Justice be influenced by our intelligence networks?
Sure. I mean, the official line is no, right? I mean, the official line is DOJ is supposed to be 100%, independent. It tracks, it follows its own line, its own criminality. But absolutely, of course, that you do have sometimes conversations about please hold back or try and accelerate it. You see that the whole time.
So Wexner was one of America's biggest donors to Israel, and Jeffrey introduced him to like-minded thinkers, including prominent academics and politicians. And the stated mission of Wexner's foundation, if you look at it online, includes strengthening leadership in the North American Jewish community and the State of Israel. So this is all in the early 1990s. Bill Clinton becomes president. And as I'm writing this, a photograph I'd heard about has finally shown up in the media. It's of Bill Clinton showing Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell around the White House in 1993. Reportedly, this was a VIP visit because Jeffrey had donated money to have the Oval Office refurbished. Now, up until that point, he didn't have much money. That's what you call access. Ben Menashe says that there's no coincidence to the timing of any of this. He says that the whole point for the Israelis of hiring Jeffrey was to influence the incoming administration's policy on Israel.
It goes back to 1992 when Bill Clinton was elected president. The Israelis were terrified that they had another Carter, another Jimmy Carter that would force them into a peace deal that they did not want. So they sent good old Jeffrey after Bill Clinton.
You know, there's a big fear amongst the Israelis that Clinton would become another Carter, a very left-wing, very left-leaning, pro-Palestinian guy, and they did not want him to do that. So they sent Epstein in really as to compromise him, to get close to him, to compromise him through money and to compromise him through other means. And I would say in some regards, that turned out to be very successful. Epstein became one of Clinton's closest friends in some ways, and also financial advisors in terms of setting up the Clinton Foundation.
So in terms of influence, Ghislaine could introduce Jeffrey to glittering individuals like Prince Andrew, as well as other foreign royals and dignitaries. But Les Wexner gave Jeffrey a route into some of the most important institutions in America. After 2010, Jeffrey boasted that he was extremely active internationally. Sources I've spoken to all over the world refer to Jeffrey, particularly in the last decade, as a fixer. Someone who could do, quote, invisible deals for people. But Jeffrey was allegedly an unusual sort of fixer because he worked in all sorts of countries and he intersected between different global networks. My sources tell me that he talked openly of how he was a link between Africa, the Middle East, Israel, and the United States. So how did this work? So I have one source who is close to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. This person explained Jeffrey's relationships in that region this way. Israel's allies became Jeffrey's business associates. To give an example, back in 2015, the United States, among other countries, entered into a nuclear deal with Iran.
President Obama is going to speak today at 7 a.m. on the Iranian deal. We will speak
today. After 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
In the summer of 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA for short, was signed by the US, Iran, and 5 other countries over Israel's furious objections.
What a stunning, historic mistake.
It restricted Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for lifting economic sanctions and put in place intensive monitoring by international inspectors.
In reaction, Sunni powers, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, moved closer to the Israelis against the Shiite-controlled Iran. So the Saudis and the Emiratis were both looking for deals in the United States and Israel. Jeffrey, according to my source, was just the guy to help. According to this person, Jeffrey made introductions for MBS and other Arab businessmen to US and Israeli hedge fund managers, who ordinarily they would not have approached cold. Plus, according to my source, Jeffrey provided the Saudis with intelligence as to what the latest Israeli thinking was geopolitically. Now, this is not classified intelligence, just general insight. One source from the Middle East whom I quoted earlier said Jeffrey was special. Not only was his alleged relationship with the Israelis watertight, but traditional adversaries of Israel, the Saudis and the Emiratis, now trusted him as a go-between. They could have used any number of conduits, But perhaps what set Jeffrey apart, and apologies in advance for saying this, but it is what my source, who's from that part of the world, said. Don't forget the importance of the punani. That means pussy. In other words, Jeffrey provided them with women.
At the White House today, Israel and 2 Arab nations signed a
Israel was making alliances of its own.
normalize relations and bring them closer together.
Trump and Netanyahu's vision for the region was becoming a reality. 2 Arab countries, the UAE and Bahrain, announced they would normalize relations with Israel in what was known as the Abraham Accords.
After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East. Thanks to the great courage of the leaders of these 3 countries.
This day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace.
Vanessa Neumann explains how he could have operated, at least theoretically.
So people like that, like an Epstein, is something what we would call sort of a hyper-connector. Because he is not only very deeply connected in one network, right? He connects different networks. And not that many people can do that and move back and forth that easily. So it's not just like he was, the American Jewish business network. He also had, the Middle East, and he could link banking to royalty, et cetera, and he could move back and forth through those groups, which means that he's very key to anybody who wants to either move money or make things happen. And it would also be valuable to the other people you would sort of attract would either be transnational crime, transnational organized crimes. And the other thing that you would attract is also sort of, because of that, the intelligence services, right? So you sort of sit in the middle of connecting the different networks, and that's very hard to replace. And they sort of gather around people who either have certain skills, which is a facilitator. Someone like an Epstein would also have this facility to link different networks. What that means is also that he's protected or would be protected by various people. When you have that kind of reach and that kind of connectivity, you have a lot of people who have a vested interest in protecting you or keeping you in power. Depending on what the deal is, he could be making money off that. He can be a proxy, a straw man, which you also, take a fee for. So all those kinds of things, and that would be pretty normal. And when you have that kind of connectivity, it means you're doing it for a number of people. And it also means that you're also helping people have conversations without them being seen to be speaking to each other, right? So if the Saudis wanted to talk to the Israelis, sometimes they would have their own quiet conversation, or sometimes you would just send someone else, send an envoy who is from neither side. And then that way you can sort of push the negotiation forward without anybody realizing that these two sides are speaking. So that's the invisible man role.
Another place ripe for meddling by an invisible man hyperfixer was Africa. Some of these cash-strapped African countries are desperate for financial help to build infrastructure and to grow their economies. But their, quote, weak state status makes them vulnerable to illicit gun, drug, and human trafficking cartels. There's been a long-standing turf war in the arms business in the region between the Israelis on one hand and the Iranians and Hezbollah on the other. And according to American experts, one of the best-known lobbyists in the region is, somewhat ironically, given his earlier connection to Robert Maxwell, Ari Ben Menashe. According to public records and to American and African intelligence sources, Ben Menashe is or has been the registered lobbyist for various strongmen and African regimes, including in Zimbabwe, Libya, Congo-Brazzaville, and the Ivory Coast. Here's an African intelligence expert who's worked in the region for 30 years. To protect his identity, we're calling him Joe, and we're altering his voice.
Ari Ben Menashe, and again, there's a bunch of Israelis doing the thing of Africa, as is Chinese and Russians. But Ari Ben Menashe and specifically through his companies, have been lobbying, which I would call, and I might be wrong, nefarious or less than favorable individuals. There is business in Africa, and whether you decide to touch it or not, that is up to you. And somebody like Ari Ben Manasseh is very open to lobbying and working on behalf of the less favorable individuals, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, all of these sort of places. So he's featured prominently.
Separate from this, Ben Manasseh is also the registered lobbyist for DP World, a maritime business with a deep reach in Africa. DP World's CEO is Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem. Now, bin Sulayem is somebody that Jeffrey bragged about knowing and doing business with, at least to Ed Epstein. Bin Sulayem and DP World have not been accused of doing anything criminal, but Jeffrey may have wanted to use them to get access for himself to do illegal deals. When Jeffrey bought his second island in the Caribbean, the name on the shell company that purchased it was Bin Sulayem's. Now it's been reported that Bin Sulayem told Jeffrey not to use his name on the paperwork for the island purchase, particularly after the seller refused to have anything to do with a convicted sex offender. But Jeffrey went ahead without Bin Sulayem's knowledge. Still, the paperwork is an indicator that there was some sort of relationship. In one of their tea meetings in the past decade, Jeffrey told the journalist Ed Epstein all about his relationship with Bin Sulayem and stressed how important it was for him financially in Africa.
He basically said he showed people, he advised people in ways to invest in these people. Well, the dictator from Djibouti, who had one of the largest tax-free, custom-free port zones he ran.
Ed's talking about the port of Djibouti, one of the busiest and most strategically important deep-water cargo ports in the world. Until 2018, Bin Sulayem's company controlled the Durala container terminal in Djibouti. The Djibouti government seized it in February of that year over a long-running dispute, and that dealt the company a major financial blow. Jeffrey told Ed that he was very close with Bin Sulayem and that they worked tightly together. He even wanted Ed to meet him and other African clients. Ed never did. So, Djibouti. In case you're not up on your geography, it lies on the Horn of Africa, part of East Africa. It's a stone's throw away from Yemen and Somalia, two terrorist hotbeds, and it's near a major oil shipping choke point, feeding Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Here's Gretchen Peters, the executive director of the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime.
Speaking more broadly, one of the things that we have seen is that a variety of foreign actors and criminal organizations have vied for control of or influence over ports up and down Africa's coasts.
It's the perfect spot from which to move weapons around the globe.
It's literally a smuggler's paradise. These long open coastlines and a variety of deep water ports that boats can be brought into.
Meanwhile, she says, the authorities who are supposed to be monitoring and controlling criminal activity are overworked and under-resourced, and highly corrupt.
There's tremendous opportunities to pay off even high-level officials in various countries. One of the patterns we've seen across Africa is it is very, very easy to move goods illicitly in and out of the continent, and therefore it becomes a transit point.
And the amount of money to be made from the port of Djibouti is infinite. That's according to Joe. He's speaking hypothetically here about Jeffrey's claim to Ed Epstein of having a close relationship with Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem from Dubai.
The port of Djibouti is a very, very important port for Africa. And if you control that individual that controls the port, you can make a fortune. And especially if you have some sort of hold over that individual, your price could be anything.
But Jeffrey's alleged influence in Africa was not limited to Djibouti. He was also close, according to a report from Africa Intelligence, with the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. Okay, so you may never have heard of Equatorial Guinea. Well, it's a very tiny but extremely oil-rich country on the west coast of Africa. It also happens to have one of the worst track records for human rights in Africa, at least according to the United Nations. It's a country run by an autocratic president, Teodoro Obiang, who's been reported on as being bribable and corrupt. Joe, my African intelligence specialist, says that it's known in his circles that Jeffrey and Teodoro's son, Teodorin, were trying to make some kind of business deal. Teodorin Obiang, the son, by the way, is a fairly colourful character. He's 52, and he has extremely expensive tastes. He's also been charged and convicted of money laundering by the French Justice Department. The matter has since been settled out of court. The Brazilian Department of Justice has ongoing investigations into his activities there, and in 2017 he paid a visit to Las Vegas in which one of his entourage died. According to Joe and two other sources, the intelligence world knows that Teodorin and Jeffrey used to meet in Jeffrey's home in Paris. A lawyer for Teodorin has denied this to Africa Intelligence magazine. What's unclear, however, is how successful these attempted business efforts were. What is known by a couple of intelligence sources is that Teodorin's father refused to deal with Jeffrey, and that Jeffrey created a rift in the first family. I asked a source of mine who covers Equatorial Guinea if Jeffrey had likely made money from the association. The reply? If he didn't, he'd be the first person not to make money out of such a relationship. So to sum up, the Africans weren't his only source of business. Jeffrey had many networks, and unusually for a hyperfixer, he was brazen about them. My sources say that his long-standing relationship to the Israelis was still intact all the while.
You'll hear the name being dropped of Mossad regularly, that he had ties back to Mossad. I mean, why would Ehud Barak visit his place 36 times? Why would he, regularly have access to the White House when he would go see Clinton? Did you get a feeling from the 100 hours you guys spoke together that there was any ties to the Mossad?
I have been at Epstein's house many, many, many times when Ehud Barak was there. Certainly a dozen times, maybe more.
Oh, wow.
Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein were very close. I mean, I think they were certainly among each other's closer friends.
Documents have surfaced revealing startling details about the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, shedding new light on Epstein's global connections and his involvement in the surveillance industry. Leaked emails suggest that Epstein wasn't just a financier of secretive projects, but was actively seeking to shape the future of global security with the help of powerful figures. Following his arrest for sex crimes, Epstein sought a new career path in the surveillance sector. In 2015, he partnered with Barak to invest in a security tech startup, Reporty Homeland Security, now known as Carbine. But this wasn't just about business. Epstein aimed to build connections with influential global figures. The leak of over 100,000 emails from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's inbox paints a picture of Jeffrey Epstein not just as a financier, but as someone eager to sit at the crossroads of private wealth and global surveillance. Among the revelations, Epstein was reportedly arranging a meeting with Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder and Palantir CEO, in 2014. Epstein even asked Barak to spend real time with Thiel to build further connections.
And moreover, it's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow cowed into thinking that that's naughty. There is nothing wrong with saying that.
These shocking details have reignited discussions around Epstein's mysterious ties, with right-wing pundit Tucker Carlson even suggesting that Epstein had been working with Israeli intelligence during the years he was allegedly trafficking minors. Carlson, speaking at the Turning Point USA summit, added fuel to the ongoing conspiracy theories surrounding Epstein's ties to global power networks. Epstein's efforts weren't just limited to Silicon Valley. In 2015, he introduced Barack to Russian business elites connected to Vladimir Putin's circle. Leaked emails show Epstein positioning himself as an apolitical go-between, offering advice to navigate US sanctions and suggesting meetings with Russian officials on markets and financial systems. Epstein's interest in surveillance technology was more than just financial. He was deeply involved in tech discussions, asking Barack about emerging trends like cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and Israeli military strategies. Through reporting, Epstein sought to influence emergency response technologies, even engaging with a former Israeli intelligence officer to keep tabs on these developments. Despite Epstein's involvement, Barak tried to distance himself publicly. In 2019, after Epstein's rearrest, Barak announced he was dissolving his partnership with Epstein. But as the leaked emails show, their ties were deep, with Barak seeking Epstein's investment advice for other ventures, including Levitation, an electromagnetic imaging startup. These emails offer a rare glimpse into Epstein's network of influence, one that spanned across industries and borders. As the fallout continues, the implications of Epstein's relationships with global power players like Barack, Thiel, and Russian elites raise troubling questions about the intersection of surveillance, technology, and international power. With the leaks now public, the ripple effects are only just beginning.
The emails show in this that Epstein actively was brokering between Ehud Barak and Peter Thiel's world. This is nuts, okay? Epstein wasn't just hanging around. This guy was inserting Israeli surveillance technology into Silicon Valley's bloodstream. And he was using Ehud Barak as the face and himself as the connector in this whole thing. So even after his 2008 sexual conviction, speaking of Jeffrey Epstein, Epstein was in the room and he was pushing deals to one of the most powerful tech investors in America in this. This is massive, okay? In the emails, in the leak, it showed that Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein discussing how to position Reporty or Carbine, the rebranding of his company, this tech company, as a solution for U.S. emergency services, basically as the next gen 911 system that they wanted to put in place. And so this means that Epstein wasn't just hovering around billionaires. This guy was actually helping with the infrastructure that could shape how American police, fire departments, and you're talking emergency services, handled citizen data. That means locations, you're talking videos, you're talking voice surveillance, everything, okay? So Epstein's network basically reached into the U.S. Homeland Security technology and not just parties and flight logs, okay? Not just these bashes and flight logs. We're talking real systems running on American soil. This is crazy, okay? Let that sink in for a second. Jeffrey Epstein and Ehud Barak, they didn't do any of this stuff alone. They pulled in a guy by the name of Pinchas Burchis, a retired general from the Unit 8200. Basically, it's Israel's elite cyber intelligence unit. They could be compared to America's NSA, okay? And so Carbine, the tech company, right? It wasn't just an app. It was a surveillance system with intelligence-grade talent behind it. And it was being pitched to U.S. investors and government agencies with Epstein as the fixer. And so this convicted sex offender, this trafficker, was sitting at the table with Israeli military intelligence veterans, helping to launch a company designed to collect real-time data on civilians. And you can think about what's recently happened with this school shooting that took place in Minnesota. You see the fact that Palantir has invested and is connected with Gideon, who's owned by Aaron Cohen, an ex-IDF guy who says that he's ready to unleash and roll out this new, Israeli level ontology type of surveillance system and tech that's going to go into 911 systems for police. It's going to go into schools, etc., and be able to find the threat detection with AI built in before those threats actually become a reality. And so now you can see kind of how these guys have been working on this type of stuff to get these data sets, these data points, and access to this tech and own it, and then get into these spaces really early on. It's quite wild to see. The overarching revelation is that Epstein was the broker in this whole thing in a lot of different details. So reading through these emails, there's a pattern that becomes crystal clear. Epstein is pushing, connecting, and setting things up. So he's not just some side character and somebody who is just an acquaintance of Ehud Barak. He is the broker and close friend of this guy. He's attaching himself to Ehud Barak. He's arranging meetings. He's urging him towards certain investors, and he's smoothing several key introductions with very powerful, wealthy people. So it shows why Epstein survived so long in the elite circles that he did, even after his convictions. He wasn't just being tolerated in this sense. He was being useful all the way through and through. So he was the guy who could open the doors, and Ehud Barak was one of the beneficiaries of this whole thing. And so Epstein's true currency that you see wasn't his money. It was his access. And the emails in this case, again, if they are true, they prove this. And then we can go back to Carbine today, that tech app, right? That was initially, rejected and then eventually invested by Peter Thiel's Founders Fund and then basically pushed into these U.S. circles. Here's the kicker in this whole thing. Carbine didn't die with Jeffrey Epstein. It's actually still alive and it's still operating. It's actually been deployed in the United States 9/11 systems, basically marketed to governments as the future of emergency response. And so this company seeded by Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein, later funded by Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, is handling real-time citizen data in American cities right now.